It was an ordinary Wednesday afternoon, the kind where the sun hung lazily in the sky and the world seemed to move slower than usual. Officer Nathan Carson sat in his patrol car, a slight hum from the engine the only sound that broke the quiet. He hadn't expected anything unusual during his shift. After all, the park he was assigned to patrol was peaceful, almost too peaceful. But sometimes, it's the most routine of days that turn out to be anything but. Nathan flicked on the radio, its crackling static filling the cabin for a moment before the voice of dispatch broke through. All units, routine patrols only. Nothing to report. He sighed, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel. It had been hours of checking the same benches, the same trees, and the same walking paths. A slow day, but the job required his attention regardless of the lack of excitement. He glanced around the park once more, watching joggers, dog walkers, and children chasing each other on the playground. He was about to check his phone for messages when something caught his eye, a figure sitting on one of the worn wooden benches at the far end of the park. The man was old, his back hunched, his clothes tattered from years of wear. He wasn't moving, just staring straight ahead, almost like he was waiting for something, or someone. It wasn't unusual to see elderly people in the park, but there was something about the man that made Nathan's instincts flare. He looked out of place. Not just because of his ragged clothes, but because he seemed distant, detached from the world around him. Most people who visited the park were engaged, even in the smallest ways, but this man seemed to exist in his own world. Nathan's training kicked in. Observe first. Approach with caution. He pulled his patrol car over and parked at a distance, watching the man for a moment longer. The elderly figure didn't seem to acknowledge the car, nor did he show any sign of being aware of Nathan's presence. That's when Nathan decided to get out and make his way over. Something told him that this wasn't just another case of a homeless person passing through. As Nathan walked toward the bench, the old man didn't move. The air around them felt thicker now, charged with an unspoken tension. Who was this man? Why was he so still? These questions gnawed at Nathan's mind as he closed the distance. When he was just a few feet away, Nathan cleared his throat to make his presence known. "Sir," he said, his voice even but firm. "Can I help you with anything?" The elderly man didn't react at first. His hands were clasped tightly in his lap, and his gaze remained fixed on some distant point in the distance. He was as motionless as a statue. After a long moment, he shifted his head slowly, but just enough to catch a glimpse of Nathan. There was a faint glimmer of recognition in the man's eyes, but it was quickly replaced by an expression of weariness, one that suggested he had seen too much in his lifetime to be easily rattled. Nathan repeated himself. "Sir, I'm Officer Carson. Is everything okay?" The elderly man's lips parted, and he spoke in a soft, raspy voice that took a moment to form words. "I'm just sitting. Just passing through." Nathan raised an eyebrow. Passing through? This was no ordinary day at the park. No one simply passed through here. It was a small, quiet space, meant for people to take a break, relax, or spend time with family. The more Nathan looked at this man, the more something didn't add up. "Do you need any help?" Nathan pressed, his concern growing. The man's eyes flickered briefly, almost as if calculating how much to say. After a beat, he spoke again. "No. I'm fine." Nathan studied him for a moment longer, weighing his options. The man wasn't exactly breaking any laws, but something felt off. The way he was sitting, too still. Too guarded. It was almost as if he was waiting for someone. But waiting for what? Or who? "I can call someone for you." "A family member or," Nathan began, but the elderly man interrupted him with a sharp gesture. "No," the man said, his voice more forceful this time, but still barely above a whisper. "There's no one." Nathan paused, the gravity of the statement settling in. No one. It wasn't uncommon for elderly people to become isolated over time, but the man's response struck a chord with Nathan. There was a hint of finality in it, a kind of resignation that made Nathan wonder what had brought the man to this place. Who had he been before? What had his life been like? A sudden thought crossed Nathan's mind: was the man in need of medical attention? Had he been sitting there for too long? What if he was lost? What if he didn't have anyone left? Just as Nathan was about to ask if he needed any kind of assistance, if he should call an ambulance or take him to a shelter, the wind shifted, carrying with it a faint sound of footsteps behind him. He turned around instinctively, his hand briefly brushing the side of his holster. His instincts were on alert. A woman emerged from behind a row of trees, walking briskly toward them. She was tall, dressed in dark, almost military-like clothing, with her hair pulled back tightly into a severe bun. She moved with purpose, her eyes locked onto the elderly man on the bench as if she had been looking for him. Nathan's gaze followed the woman, but the elderly man seemed to recognize her before Nathan did. He straightened ever so slightly, his posture changing as though some deep instinct had kicked in. It was subtle, but it was there, this shift in his behavior. His face, which had been blank and distant, now seemed to tighten in a way that suggested he knew exactly who this woman was. The woman's eyes didn't move from the elderly man as she approached. She didn't even acknowledge Nathan at first, and for a moment, he thought about stepping in. But there was something in her eyes, something cold and commanding that stopped him. She wasn't just another park-goer. She was here for a reason. The woman stopped just a few feet away from the bench. Her gaze remained fixed on the elderly man. "It's time," she said, her voice low but carrying an undeniable authority. The man didn't speak for a long moment. He just stared at her, his face unreadable. Then, finally, he whispered, "I didn't want this day to come." Nathan felt a chill run down his spine. The way they were interacting, so familiar, yet so distant, spoke volumes about the history between them. There was something more here than just a casual encounter. Something that Nathan couldn't quite place. The woman shifted her weight, her eyes finally flicking toward Nathan, as if she had just noticed his presence. She didn't flinch or show surprise, it was almost as if she had been expecting him. She nodded in his direction, her gaze cold and calculating. "You're the officer," she said. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact. She spoke as though she had already been briefed on his presence, as though this was part of a plan she had been executing for some time. Nathan nodded, his instinctual wariness sharpening. "I am." "And you are?" The woman didn't answer immediately. She simply looked at him for a moment, sizing him up, before turning her attention back to the elderly man. "He knows more than you think. More than you'll ever know." Nathan felt his heart race. What was she talking about? Who was this man? Before Nathan could ask another question, the elderly man spoke again, his voice shaking. "She's right. I know too much. I just wish I could forget." The words hit Nathan like a punch to the gut. His mind raced. What was going on? Who was this man, really? And why did the woman seem so certain that he had secrets too dangerous to be known? As the conversation hung in the air, filled with more questions than answers, Nathan's heart pounded in his chest. He knew then that this was no ordinary patrol. This was the beginning of something much bigger, something that would lead him down a path filled with mysteries, danger, and unimaginable truths. Cliffhanger. Just as the elderly man seemed ready to say more, the sound of approaching footsteps interrupted them. Someone else was coming. Someone who would change everything. The officer's footsteps echoed across the park, a rhythm that seemed to grow louder in the silence. The day had begun as any other, routine, mundane, with the kind of predictable stillness that made patrols feel like a chore. But as he stood facing the elderly man, something felt off. The man, despite his age and tattered appearance, had an air about him, a kind of quiet defiance, an unspoken story hiding behind those deep, tired eyes. The officer's first instinct was to push the man further, demand answers to questions that had been simmering in his mind. But there was something about the old man's demeanor that made him hesitate, just for a moment. He pressed on, though. "What are you doing here?" The words felt colder, sharper, meant to show authority. The elderly man did not flinch. He didn't even raise his head immediately. He just sat there, his eyes half-lidded as if lost in a world of his own. "Just sitting," the man murmured, almost as if he were speaking to himself. The officer looked down at the man, his frown deepening. "You're in a public park," he stated, as if that alone should explain the man's need to justify his presence. But still, the man did not respond. The officer's patience was wearing thin. He stepped closer, staring down at the frail figure before him. "You can't just sit here all day, you know. What's your name?" The question was sharp, cutting through the air. The man's lips trembled, but his voice remained calm, like someone who had long ago learned to suppress the emotions that might give others a glimpse into his past. I don't have one anymore," he said quietly, eyes now distant, as if the words themselves carried a weight that went beyond simple identification. The officer's frown deepened. "What do you mean you don't have a name?" "Everyone has a name." The elderly man remained silent. His gaze was fixed on the ground, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The officer stood there for a moment, his mind racing, trying to make sense of the man's odd response. But as the minutes passed, a sense of unease began to creep into the officer's thoughts. Something wasn't right here. It was at that moment that a strange sound, footsteps, reached the officer's ears. The park, normally quiet and still, now seemed to hum with an unusual energy. The officer's eyes darted around, scanning the park. His hand instinctively brushed over his radio, ready to call for backup, but the figures in the distance made him pause. A woman, tall and composed, stood at the edge of the trees, watching them. At first, the officer thought nothing of it. People walked in parks all the time, but this woman was different. Her stance was rigid, as if she were standing on guard. She wore a dark, fitted jacket and had a look about her, one of someone used to being in control, to making things happen, no matter the cost. She wasn't just another passerby. Without any hesitation, she moved forward, her gaze fixed firmly on the officer and the elderly man. There was something about her presence that made the officer uneasy, as if her very appearance changed the air around him, tightening it in a way that he couldn't explain. "Is there a problem, officer?" Her voice sliced through the tension in the air. It was calm, yet there was an undeniable intensity in it, as if she already knew everything he was about to say. The officer blinked, taken aback by the abruptness of her question. He opened his mouth to speak but hesitated. There was no immediate threat, at least, none he could see, but the way she stood, the way she watched them, felt off. "I'm just asking him what he's doing here," the officer replied, his voice measured but still tinged with an undercurrent of annoyance. His eyes darted to the elderly man, who hadn't moved an inch, as though the world around him no longer mattered. The woman's gaze shifted to the man, and something in her expression changed. It was subtle, but it was there, an almost imperceptible flicker of recognition, of understanding. Her eyes softened, but only for a moment. Then she spoke, her voice low and controlled. "You don't remember me, do you?" she asked, turning back to the elderly man, her tone no longer questioning, but almost resigned. The officer's brows furrowed in confusion. "What are you talking about?" "Do you know him?" he demanded, his suspicion now piqued. Who was this woman, and why was she so interested in an old man who appeared to be lost in his own world? The elderly man didn't respond. His eyes remained downcast, his hands still folded together. But as the woman took a step closer to him, the officer could see his fingers trembling slightly. "No," the woman continued, her voice softening. "I suppose he doesn't. Not after all these years." The officer was about to ask another question when the elderly man suddenly spoke, his voice barely a whisper. I don't want to remember." The woman's expression tightened, but she said nothing. She simply stood there for a moment, as if weighing the decision of whether to continue. Then, with a deep breath, she finally spoke. "He saved me, officer," she said, her voice unsteady now, though she tried to mask the emotion. "He doesn't remember me, but I remember him. I've been searching for him for years. You wouldn't believe what he did for me." The officer blinked, his mind racing to make sense of her words. A deep sense of foreboding settled in his gut. Something was happening here, something far more complex than a simple routine patrol. This woman wasn't just any passerby, and this elderly man wasn't just some random figure sitting on a park bench. But before he could say anything, the woman's gaze snapped back to him, her voice taking on a more commanding tone. "You don't know who he really is. But I do. And that's why I'm here. To make sure he doesn't disappear again." The officer felt his heart rate quicken. His instincts told him that he was being pulled into something far bigger than he had anticipated. A wave of confusion and fear mixed in his chest as he stared between the woman and the elderly man. What was going on here? "He's not just some old man," she continued, her voice growing urgent. "He was involved in something dangerous. Something that could change everything." The officer's mind was spinning. Danger? What was this woman talking about? And what did she mean by change everything? Was she implying that this man, this frail figure sitting on a park bench, was somehow connected to a past that was too dangerous to confront? "I need to know what's going on," the officer said, his voice sharp now, a mix of authority and growing concern. The elderly man remained silent, his eyes still focused on the ground. But the woman spoke again, her words tinged with an emotion that the officer couldn't quite place. "It's not just about him," she said quietly. "It's about what he knows. What he's seen. The truth that's been buried for so long. And the people who will stop at nothing to make sure it stays buried." The officer's mind was racing. What could he possibly mean by that? Who were these people the woman was talking about? What truth was so important that it had to be hidden for years? Before the officer could ask another question, the elderly man suddenly shifted. His hands were trembling more visibly now, and he looked up at the woman for the first time. His eyes were filled with a deep sorrow, but they also held something else: recognition, understanding. A weighty kind of knowledge. "Tell him," the man whispered, his voice breaking as he looked at the woman. The woman's face softened, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. But she took a deep breath, as if bracing herself for what she was about to reveal. The officer could sense that whatever she was about to say would be far more than he was prepared to hear. "Not yet," she said, her voice low and firm. "He's not ready." The officer's pulse quickened as he looked at the two of them, two people connected by a secret, a truth that was too dangerous to speak. He felt an unspoken shift in the air, an invisible thread binding them together, pulling him into a mystery he hadn't expected but couldn't ignore. The park around them had gone eerily still. The world seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something momentous to happen. The officer's mind raced with questions, but one stood out above all: what was so important about this man? And why was this woman willing to put herself, and him, at such great risk to uncover the truth? Cliffhanger. Before the officer could press for more answers, the distant sound of approaching footsteps broke through the silence. Someone was coming. But who? And why? The footsteps grew louder, each echo carrying a weight of uncertainty. Nathan's senses heightened as he glanced around the park, trying to locate the source of the sound. The woman standing in front of him remained calm, but there was an intensity in her eyes now, an urgency that hadn't been there before. The elderly man, still sitting motionless on the bench, hadn't reacted yet. His face was drawn, his eyes distant, as if he were trapped between the present and the past. But now, there was a visible tension in his body, a subtle shift, a tightening of his posture. Nathan could feel it, the undeniable pull of something unfolding just beneath the surface. Suddenly, a man emerged from behind the trees. He was tall, sharply dressed in a suit that looked too pristine for the park, his face marked by the hard lines of experience. There was something about his presence that immediately commanded attention. He moved with purpose, walking toward them with an air of authority that left no room for hesitation. The woman didn't flinch at his approach. She didn't even seem surprised. Instead, she took a small step to the side, allowing him to take center stage. He didn't acknowledge her, his eyes were fixed solely on the elderly man. "Thomas," the man said, his voice deep and calm, but tinged with a quiet menace. The elderly man flinched, his hands gripping the edge of the bench tighter. "You should have known this day would come." Nathan's heart raced. Thomas? So that was the man's name. But there was something far more unsettling about the way the stranger had spoken, as though he was familiar with the elderly man on a level that went beyond a casual acquaintance. There was a history here, one that had clearly been brewing for years, perhaps even decades. The elderly man, Thomas, finally looked up, his eyes locking with the stranger's. "I didn't ask for this," he muttered, his voice barely audible. The man in the suit stood a few feet away now, a quiet dominance radiating from him. He stared down at Thomas, his face cold, calculating. "Does it matter? You knew the consequences of your actions. You knew what would happen if you refused to cooperate." Thomas's lips trembled as he opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Nathan could feel the weight of the conversation, the unsaid truths hanging heavily in the air. Something had happened between these two men, something that neither of them seemed willing to fully explain. But Nathan wasn't in the dark anymore. He couldn't be. He had to know what was going on. The old man was clearly a part of something far bigger than what it seemed on the surface. And this man, this stranger, he wasn't just another park-goer. He was someone who had power over Thomas, someone who could control the narrative, the actions, even the life of the elderly man sitting helplessly in front of him. Nathan stepped forward, his voice steady but filled with authority. "Excuse me," he said, addressing the man in the suit. "I'm Officer Carson. I need to know what's going on here." The man in the suit didn't even glance at him. His attention was still solely on Thomas. "Stay out of this, officer," he replied, his voice like steel. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." Nathan's patience thinned. He wasn't about to back down. "I don't know who you are, but I'm a law enforcement officer. And I can't just stand by while." "You don't understand," the man interrupted, his tone growing darker. "This is far beyond your pay grade. You're out of your depth." Nathan's mind raced. What was this man talking about? What did he mean, out of your depth? Before he could press further, the woman, who had remained silent up until this point, finally spoke. "Let him ask, Victor," she said, her voice soft but firm. "If it's meant to happen, it will. Let's give him the truth." Victor, the man in the suit, finally turned to face Nathan, his eyes narrowing. There was a flicker of something unsettling in his gaze, a recognition perhaps. Nathan felt a chill crawl up his spine as Victor sized him up, as if weighing whether it was worth it to continue this confrontation. "I don't have time for this," Victor muttered. "Thomas," he turned back to the elderly man. "We've come for you. You can't hide forever." Thomas winced, his eyes flicking toward the woman standing nearby, who now looked almost sympathetic, as if she was torn between loyalty to the man in the suit and a sense of pity for the elderly man. The woman spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. You can't run anymore. They'll come for you no matter where you go. Nathan's pulse quickened. Who were they? Who was coming for Thomas, and why did they have this much power over him? He couldn't just stand there anymore. His instincts were screaming at him. This was more than a simple case of an elderly man in distress. This was a situation that reeked of something darker, something far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. The more questions Nathan asked, the more answers slipped away, like smoke in the wind. Who are you? Nathan demanded, his voice cutting through the tension. Victor looked at him one last time before speaking, his words slow and deliberate. You don't want to know the answer to that question. But I'll give you a hint, we're the ones who pull the strings. We always have. The woman stepped forward now, her eyes locked on Nathan's. It's better that you don't get involved, she said. For your sake. Nathan shook his head. I don't care about what's better for me. I'm here to protect this man, he said, gesturing to Thomas. And if someone's after him, I'll make sure they don't get to him. Victor chuckled darkly, the sound of it sending a chill through Nathan's veins. You're brave, officer. But sometimes, bravery can be your biggest weakness. If you get in the way, you'll only regret it. The woman's expression shifted, no longer sympathetic but cold and calculating. You've been warned. Just as she spoke, Thomas suddenly stood, his legs shaky as he gripped the bench for support. Enough, he said, his voice much stronger than it had been before. Enough of this. I'll go with you. Nathan turned to face Thomas, his mind reeling. What was happening? Why was he giving in? Thomas's eyes met Nathan's, and for a brief moment, there was clarity in them. It's the only way, officer. It's the only way to keep you safe. Before Nathan could ask him what he meant, Thomas turned and began to walk slowly toward Victor, as if resigned to his fate. The woman moved to follow, but not before glancing back at Nathan with a knowing look that sent a shiver down his spine. Don't say we didn't warn you, she said, her voice a warning laced with finality. As the three figures moved toward the exit of the park, Nathan stood frozen, unable to comprehend what had just happened. His hands trembled slightly as the weight of the situation settled on him. He had stepped into something far more complex and dangerous than he could have ever anticipated. And the unsettling feeling gnawing at him told him that this was just the beginning. Cliffhanger. Just before the trio left the park, Thomas stopped. He looked back over his shoulder at Nathan one final time. You're not safe either, he whispered, his voice barely audible. They know who you are. Nathan stood in the center of the park, his mind swirling with confusion and unease. The trio of figures had walked away, leaving him in a state of disbelief. They know who you are. Thomas's last words echoed in his mind like a warning that he couldn't quite escape. It felt as if a veil had been lifted, revealing a hidden world he had never even imagined. His instincts told him to follow, to press for answers. But something held him back. What if he was getting in over his head? What if he was about to uncover something so dangerous that it would be better left untouched? But then again, Thomas needed him. Whatever this was, this strange, unspoken threat, it had to be stopped. With a final glance at the empty park bench, Nathan pulled his phone from his pocket. He was still trying to piece things together, but the one thing he could be sure of was that this wasn't a simple case. It wasn't just an officer being called to intervene in a confrontation. This was something much bigger. Who were these people? Why did they want Thomas? And why was Thomas suddenly so compliant? He dialed his partner, Detective Rachel Morris. Carson, she answered on the second ring, her voice a mix of routine and alertness. What's going on? Rachel, you wouldn't believe what's happening here, Nathan said, his words tumbling out before he could even stop them. I've got an elderly man who's being, well, I don't even know what to call it. There are people after him, and I think he's involved in something shady. There was a brief silence on the other end, a pause that made Nathan's stomach tighten. "Go on," she said, her voice suddenly more focused. "I'm telling you, Rachel, this goes deeper than what it seems on the surface. There's a man in a suit, Victor, who's part of this. He's like, controlling Thomas somehow. And there's a woman with them, and they're all after him for something." Rachel let out a slow breath. "Is Thomas okay?" Nathan glanced around, scanning the park for any sign of them. "I don't know. I don't think so. He hesitated. "Rachel, I think I'm being watched. Something's off. I'm getting that feeling. Like there's something behind all of this that no one wants me to see." Rachel's voice softened, sensing his unease. "Nathan, listen to me. Don't dive in head first without more information. You know this isn't just a normal case. If it's as dangerous as you think it is, we need to involve the right people. Let me make some calls. I'll help you. Just stay put." Nathan wanted to protest, wanted to charge ahead and confront whoever was pulling the strings. But Rachel's tone was firm, calm. It grounded him. As much as his gut was screaming at him to act, he knew she was right. This wasn't something he could handle alone. "I'll wait." "But Rachel," he paused, trying to put his feelings into words. "There's something bigger at play here. I just know it." "I trust you," she said. "We'll figure this out. Just don't do anything reckless." After hanging up, Nathan stood there for a moment longer, looking around, trying to make sense of everything. The park had gone eerily silent. The echoes of the confrontation with Thomas and Victor still lingered in the air like an unresolved melody. He knew he needed answers, and fast. Nathan decided to head back to his patrol car, but as he passed through the park's entrance, something caught his eye. It was a small, out-of-place item lying in the dirt near the bushes. A black leather wallet, partially open. Curiosity tugged at him, and he bent down to retrieve it. As he flipped it open, he froze. There, staring up at him, was an ID card. The name on it read, Victor Harrow. Victor Harrow. The man who had confronted Thomas. The man who had claimed he knew exactly what would happen if Thomas didn't comply. Nathan's mind raced. This wasn't just a random wallet left behind. This was a clue. He quickly scanned the rest of the wallet. There were several business cards, a few bills, and a keycard for an upscale building in the city. The address on the card was familiar. It was a luxury apartment complex in the heart of downtown. Nathan had driven by it countless times but had never given it a second thought. But now, it felt like everything was connected. Victor Harrow. That name, was it just a coincidence that it was so close to the confrontation? Nathan's mind was turning over the possibilities. He could feel his pulse quicken. This was more than a random encounter. There was intention here. And Nathan was beginning to realize that whatever he had stumbled into, it was far from accidental. 2 hours later. Nathan sat in his car, the wallet resting on the passenger seat beside him. He couldn't stop thinking about the luxury apartment. Something told him that it held the answers he needed. He had to get there. His phone buzzed, and he quickly grabbed it, expecting it to be Rachel. Instead, it was an unknown number. Hesitating for a moment, Nathan answered. "Officer Carson?" A deep, unfamiliar voice said on the other end. "Yes," Nathan replied, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "This is Thomas," the voice said. It was barely above a whisper, and Nathan had to strain to hear. "You don't know who you're dealing with. If you keep going down this road, there's no coming back from it." Nathan's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" he demanded. "What's happening? What do they want from you?" "I can't tell you everything. But I'll tell you this much, Victor is part of something far bigger than you could ever imagine. There are people involved who have no problem crushing anyone who gets in their way. You've already seen too much. They won't let you leave it alone. Nathan's mind raced. Thomas, what are you saying? What are you involved in? I can't explain. But, there's a way to stop them. Find the apartment, Carson. Find the keycard. It's your only chance to understand. Before Nathan could respond, the line went dead. Cliffhanger. Nathan sat there, staring at his phone. The suddenness of the call left him shaken. The apartment. Thomas had just given him his first real lead. But what would he find there? Would it be the answers he desperately needed, or would it plunge him deeper into the web of lies and danger that was quickly closing in around him? Nathan's hands were steady, but his mind was racing as he pulled the car into the underground parking garage of the luxury apartment complex. The keycard sat heavy in his pocket, its presence both reassuring and unnerving at the same time. Find the apartment, Thomas had said. It's your only chance to understand. That cryptic message, the weight of it, settled in Nathan's chest like a stone. What was he about to uncover? Who were these people, and why had they targeted Thomas? And most importantly, why had Thomas reached out to him, of all people, before everything had gone quiet? As Nathan parked the car, the garage echoed with the quiet hum of his engine. The building was sleek, modern, a high-rise of mirrored glass and steel. It was a place where wealth and power mingled, where deals were made and lives were quietly shaped without ever being noticed by the world outside. But what Nathan knew for sure was that he was stepping into a world far darker than he had ever imagined. He got out of the car, adjusting his jacket as he walked toward the elevator. The building was immaculate, all marble floors and polished surfaces. It felt almost sterile, like a place where real people didn't exist. Nathan's eyes scanned the surroundings as he pressed the button to the elevator. The air was too clean, the light too bright. He felt out of place, like an intruder in a world he didn't belong in. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and Nathan stepped inside. He pressed the floor for apartment 12C, where the keycard was supposed to take him. As the elevator ascended, his mind returned to Thomas. That phone call had left him rattled. Victor Harrow, the name that had been on the wallet, was the key. He had to be. But Nathan couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this, more than just a confrontation between an officer and an elderly man. He didn't know who Thomas really was or what had led him to this point. But the more Nathan uncovered, the less he understood. It was all starting to feel like a puzzle with pieces that didn't fit. Why would Thomas, an elderly man, seemingly so harmless, be involved in something like this? The elevator dinged, pulling Nathan from his thoughts. The doors slid open, revealing a sleek, contemporary hallway with long, polished floors. At the end of the hall, apartment 12C loomed, its door a rich, dark wood with a small brass plaque beside it. Nathan's pulse quickened. He approached the door cautiously, keycard in hand, fingers grazing the cool metal. He slid it into the slot, and after a brief moment, the lock clicked open. With a deep breath, he pushed the door open. Inside the apartment. The apartment was even more impressive than Nathan had expected. It was expansive, the kind of place that took your breath away the moment you stepped inside. The decor was minimalist, yet there was an air of luxury in everything, from the modern art pieces hanging on the walls to the expensive furniture that filled the space. It was the kind of apartment that made a statement. But Nathan wasn't here to admire the view. He wasn't even sure why he felt so uneasy, but something in his gut told him to be on high alert. What was Thomas trying to tell him? As Nathan stepped into the apartment, his footsteps echoed on the hardwood floor. The entire space felt still, too still, like no one had been here for days. A faint scent of perfume lingered in the air, but there was something off about it. It wasn't comforting, it was cold. His eyes swept across the room, looking for anything out of place. He moved toward the living room, where the large floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the city skyline. The lights of the city twinkled below, but up here, in the quiet of the apartment, the lights felt far away, disconnected. His gaze landed on a coffee table in the center of the room. On it, there was a stack of papers, some scattered, others neatly piled. It seemed to be a mixture of personal documents, contracts, and papers with legal jargon that Nathan could barely make sense of. But one piece of paper caught his attention, a photograph. Nathan picked it up, his heart skipping a beat. It was an old photograph, faded and creased at the edges. In the picture were several people standing together, smiling, posing in front of a building. Among them was a much younger version of Thomas. But the other people in the picture were not familiar. The most striking detail was the man standing next to Thomas. He looked eerily familiar, his sharp suit, his commanding presence. Nathan knew immediately. It was Victor Harrow. Nathan's breath caught in his throat. What was this photo doing here, in Victor's apartment? And why was Thomas with him? He flipped the photograph over, revealing a handwritten message on the back in ink that had begun to fade, to the future, together, always. VH. A chill ran down Nathan's spine. Together, always. That was more than just a sentiment. It was a promise, a bond, something far deeper than he had imagined. The hidden room. Nathan set the photograph down carefully and continued his search. He moved toward the hallway, where the doors to 2 bedrooms and a study were located. He tried each door, one was locked, the other slightly ajar. He pushed it open to find a small study, the walls lined with bookshelves filled with various legal and financial books. But one shelf, in particular, caught his eye. It was almost hidden behind a row of books, a shelf that seemed a little too perfect to be part of the regular arrangement. Nathan reached for it, and as he did, the bookshelf slid aside, revealing a hidden room behind it. The room was small, dimly lit by a single desk lamp, and filled with rows of filing cabinets. There were stacks of paperwork everywhere, and what stood out most was the safe embedded in the wall. He stepped forward, his heart racing. The safe had no obvious keypad or combination lock, just a keyhole. Nathan looked around the room for any clues. A safe like this wouldn't be here without a reason. He scanned the room for anything that might give him a hint. His gaze landed on a drawer tucked under the desk. He pulled it open, finding a small metal box inside. Could this be it? His fingers shook as he opened it. Inside was a key, nothing else. Nathan stared at it for a moment, trying to make sense of it. A key to the safe? He quickly grabbed the key and made his way to the safe. With a shaky hand, he inserted the key into the lock, turning it slowly. A soft click echoed through the room, and the safe door creaked open. Inside was a stack of files. Nathan's heart pounded in his chest as he pulled the top folder free. The words on the label sent a shock through him, Operation Lazarus. The revelation. Nathan skimmed through the files, his eyes widening with every page. He was looking at detailed plans, blueprints, confidential records, even photographs. These were not just business files. These were documents that detailed covert operations, transactions, and connections to organizations Nathan had only heard about in whispers. The deeper Nathan dug, the more the room seemed to close in around him. It was as though the walls were shifting, hiding secrets that no one was ever supposed to find. And then, in the final file, Nathan found something that froze him in place. It was a report. A description of a man, Officer Nathan Carson, and his connection to the investigation. Nathan's blood ran cold. They knew about him. They were watching him, waiting. This wasn't just a case of uncovering a missing person or a lost old man. Nathan had become part of the game. The files in the safe weren't just evidence of a dangerous operation. They were part of an elaborate trap, one that Nathan had unwittingly stepped into. Cliffhanger. The sudden sound of a door slamming shut echoed through the apartment, pulling Nathan from his shock. He quickly shoved the files back into the safe and turned to face the door. Someone was here. Someone was coming. Nathan uncovers a hidden room and a safe containing crucial documents that reveal a covert operation, Operation Lazarus, and evidence that he has been targeted. This part amplifies the mystery, showing that Nathan has unknowingly stepped into something far more dangerous than he initially believed. The cliffhanger heightens the suspense, leaving readers eager to know who is coming after Nathan and what will happen next. The sudden sound of the door slamming shut echoed through the apartment, sending a rush of adrenaline through Nathan's veins. His heart pounded, and every muscle in his body went rigid. Who was it? The elevator? The stairwell? A shift of footsteps followed in quick succession, someone moving with purpose. Nathan stood frozen in the middle of the study, the files tucked away in the safe, his breath coming in sharp bursts. For a moment, everything felt suspended. He had two choices: stay hidden, stay quiet, and hope the intruder wouldn't find him, or confront them and risk it all. Was this it? Was this the moment everything came crashing down? He glanced at the door. The hallway outside was silent now, but Nathan could feel the weight of the tension in the air. It was suffocating. This wasn't just about him anymore. Whatever he had stumbled upon, whatever dark secrets this apartment held, it had become personal. His life was tangled up in it now. The footsteps continued, but they were closer now, too close. The sound was unmistakable. Someone was coming toward him. Nathan's instincts screamed at him to run. But he didn't. He couldn't. He had to know who was behind this. The encounter. The footsteps stopped outside the door. Nathan's breath hitched. He could hear the soft rustling of fabric, the faint creak of the floorboards, and then, the click of a door handle. Nathan's hand instinctively reached for the nearest object, his phone, his keys, anything that could be used as a weapon. But his fingers brushed nothing but cold, smooth wood. There was a moment of silence before the door swung open. A man stepped inside. He was tall, lean, and dressed in a dark suit, a sharp contrast to the sleek apartment. His face was obscured by the dim lighting, but Nathan could see the glint of something cold in his eyes. The man didn't look surprised. He didn't look scared. He looked like he owned this place. The stranger's eyes scanned the room quickly, searching for something, someone. His gaze lingered for a moment on the desk, the bookshelf, the filing cabinets. Then, without hesitation, he moved toward the safe. Nathan's blood ran cold. He knew about the safe. He knew about the files. Nathan had to act fast. He couldn't stay here, hiding like a scared child. But every instinct told him that this man was dangerous, someone who wouldn't hesitate to put him in the ground if it meant protecting whatever secrets were locked behind that door. Without thinking, Nathan surged forward, diving into the open space between the man and the safe. The man's eyes snapped toward him, sharp and calculating. "You're not supposed to be here," the man said, his voice calm, almost amused. He didn't raise his voice, but there was a weight in his tone that felt like a warning. Nathan swallowed, his pulse racing. He didn't have time to think. He didn't have time to question why the man was so confident, why he was so sure of himself. He had to fight. "I could say the same thing to you," Nathan shot back, his voice shaking with a mix of fear and defiance. The man took a step closer, not bothering to hide his intentions. His eyes were cold, measuring. "I'm afraid you've already overstayed your welcome, Nathan." Nathan's heart skipped a beat. How did he know his name? Before Nathan could react, the man moved, quick and precise. He reached for something in his jacket pocket, pulling out a small black device and pressing it against the safe's door. There was a soft beep, and the safe clicked open. Nathan's stomach dropped. The man was already inside. The revelation. The man flipped through the files, his eyes scanning the papers with an eerie calmness. Operation Lazarus, the detailed reports, the blueprints, he seemed to know exactly what he was looking for. Nathan didn't know what to do. Should he run? Should he fight? The man looked up from the documents, locking eyes with Nathan. "I have to admit, I didn't expect you to find this so quickly," the man said, a small smile tugging at his lips. "But I should have known. You've always had a way of stumbling into things you weren't meant to." Nathan felt a rush of confusion. Who was this guy? And how did he know about him? The man seemed to sense his confusion. "You must have questions. I'll answer them, soon. But first, let's get something straight, Nathan." The stranger stepped closer, his voice lowering. "You've crossed a line you can't uncross. You've seen things, learned things, things that most people would rather leave buried." Nathan's mind raced, trying to piece it all together. His thoughts flashed back to Thomas, to the confrontation in the park, to the photograph he'd found in the apartment. Was Thomas involved in all of this? Was he somehow connected to this dangerous game? "I don't know what you're talking about," Nathan said, his voice more forceful than he felt. "I don't know who you are or why I'm here. But you're going to tell me everything. Now." The man's smile faded, his eyes narrowing. He seemed to assess Nathan for a long moment, as though trying to decide whether or not to give him the answers he sought. "You don't get to make demands, Nathan," the man said quietly, his voice low and dangerous. "But you're right about one thing. You are part of something much bigger now. Something that you can't escape from." He took another step forward, and Nathan's breath caught in his throat. The man's hand reached into his pocket again, pulling out something small and metallic. He set it down on the desk between them. It was a keycard, the same kind Nathan had seen earlier, the one Thomas had used to get into the building. What did this mean? "This," the man said, pointing at the card, "will open a door. A door that leads to more answers. If you want them, you'll follow the path." He paused for a moment, as if savoring the weight of the moment. "But be warned, Nathan. Once you step through, there's no turning back." The cliffhanger. Before Nathan could respond, the man turned on his heel, walking toward the door without another word. His footsteps were deliberate, his presence commanding. Nathan stayed rooted to the spot, his mind reeling. What was the man's game? Why had he come here? What was behind that door? As the stranger reached for the door, he stopped and glanced back over his shoulder. "I'd suggest you think very carefully before you use this keycard. It could be the last thing you ever do," he said, his voice cold. The door clicked shut behind him. Nathan stood in the silence, alone in the apartment, the keycard burning a hole in his hand. The keycard burned a hole in Nathan's palm. The weight of the situation pressed down on him like a 1,000-pound boulder, suffocating, overwhelming. He could still hear the sound of the door clicking shut behind the mysterious man. The apartment was eerily quiet now, but the air felt thick, charged with uncertainty. Nathan paced back and forth, the keycard in his hand. What had he just gotten himself into? Each step he took seemed to echo in the silence, his thoughts racing. The man's words rang in his ears. "Once you step through, there's no turning back." He had been thrust into this world, this web of secrets, lies, and danger, with no choice but to follow the trail. But what would happen if he didn't? What would the consequences be? The keycard felt heavier with every passing second. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was his only chance to find answers, to understand the truth behind Thomas's disappearance, the strange encounter in the park, and the ominous files he'd uncovered. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. One step at a time, Nathan. He had to go forward, and there was only one place the keycard could lead him. The journey begins. Nathan stuffed the keycard into his pocket and grabbed his jacket. He hesitated for a moment, glancing at the files still stacked neatly on the desk. The photographs, the blueprints, the notes, everything screamed mystery. Everything screamed danger. But nothing was as pressing as the keycard. The elevator ride down to the building's parking garage felt like an eternity. Nathan's mind replayed every detail of the encounter with the mysterious man, the cold, calculating gaze, the promise of answers and consequences. It was all part of some game, but the rules had yet to be revealed. As the elevator doors opened with a soft chime, Nathan stepped out into the dimly lit garage. The place was mostly empty, save for a few cars parked in isolated spaces. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering occasionally, as if the building itself were trying to tell him something. He could feel the pull toward the underground levels, the place where the answers might lie, the place that the keycard would unlock. His gut twisted with both anticipation and dread. This wasn't just a mystery anymore. It was his life on the line. Nathan made his way to his car, his steps deliberate, but his heart was pounding. He needed to find out who was behind all of this, and more importantly, why they dragged him into it. A hidden door. The drive to the location was short, but it felt like hours. Nathan kept glancing in his rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone tailing him, following him, waiting for him to make a mistake. The darkness of the city streets only made the tension more palpable. He arrived at the nondescript building the keycard was meant to unlock. It was an old, run-down structure, hidden between two taller buildings, like it had been deliberately forgotten by time. The cracked windows, the peeling paint, and the rusting door made it look like something out of a forgotten era. Nathan took a deep breath as he parked his car. He sat there for a moment, staring at the building. What was this place? Why was it so important? His fingers gripped the keycard, which now seemed to pulse with an energy of its own. He stepped out of the car and walked toward the entrance, the sound of his shoes clicking against the pavement. The door was heavy, made of thick metal, and had no visible handle. But there was a small slot next to it, a card reader. Nathan hesitated for just a second before he slid the keycard into the slot. There was a soft beep, then a loud click as the door unlocked. His breath caught in his throat. He pushed the door open. It creaked as it moved, and for a moment, Nathan thought he heard something in the distance, footsteps, a murmur of voices. But when the door opened fully, the hallway was empty, save for the dim light coming from a few bare bulbs along the walls. A chill ran through him, and his skin prickled. There was something off about this place, something unsettling. Why was it so silent? A descent into the unknown. The hallway stretched ahead of him, long and narrow. The walls were made of concrete, and the air smelled of mildew and dust. It felt like the kind of place that had been forgotten by everyone except those who wanted it to remain hidden. As Nathan walked forward, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Every step echoed in the stillness. He reached a set of stairs that led downward. The stairwell was narrow, and the steps were worn from years of use. The metal railing creaked under his grip as he descended. Each floor he passed seemed to sink deeper into darkness, and he could feel the weight of each level pressing on him. He reached the bottom, and the door before him was locked. Nathan reached for the keycard in his pocket, his hand trembling slightly. He slid it into the card reader. The lock clicked open, and the door swung inward with a soft groan. He stepped into the room. A room of secrets. Inside was a vast, dimly lit space. The room was cavernous, with shelves lining the walls, each shelf filled with files, documents, and old-fashioned filing cabinets. The air was thick with dust, and the only sound was the distant hum of machinery that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the building. Nathan's heart raced as he walked deeper into the room. This wasn't just a storage facility, it was a vault of secrets. Every file, every piece of paper in this room seemed to hold a piece of the puzzle he was desperately trying to solve. He approached one of the shelves, running his fingers along the spines of the files. What was he looking for? What would give him the answers he needed? His eyes fell on a thick file in the back corner of the room. It had a worn leather cover, and the label was almost illegible, Operation Lazarus. Nathan's pulse quickened. He had seen that name before. It was on the blueprints from the files in his apartment, but he hadn't understood its significance. He pulled the file from the shelf, carefully flipping it open. The contents were a mix of photos, reports, and sketches, everything written in a language of codes and ciphers. But there were a few pieces of information that stood out. At the center of the file was a diagram of the building Nathan was standing in. It was all connected. The building, the keycard, the man who had confronted him, this was more than just a random series of events. It was a calculated, deliberate plan. The truth revealed. Nathan's hands shook as he scanned the pages. This wasn't just some corporate espionage. This wasn't about money. This was far bigger, far darker. The files contained proof of a covert operation involving high-level government officials, a secret project known as Lazarus. The project involved the manipulation of biological research, including human trials. It wasn't about saving lives, it was about creating weapons. The project was supposed to have been shut down years ago. The files detailed how the project had gone underground, kept secret by those in power. And Nathan had just uncovered it. This was why the mysterious man had come to him. This was why Thomas had disappeared. Nathan was in the middle of something that went far beyond his understanding. The stakes were higher than he could have ever imagined. And now, there was no going back. The cliffhanger. As Nathan pieced together the fragments of the puzzle, he heard a sound, footsteps approaching from the far end of the room. Someone was coming. He didn't have time to hide. He didn't have time to think. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Nathan's heart pounded in his chest as he slammed the file shut and backed into the shadows. Who was it? Was it the same man from before? Had someone else found him? Before he could make a move, the lights in the room flickered once, then went out, plunging him into darkness. The room was pitch black. Nathan's heart thundered in his chest, each beat an echo in the silence. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and he could feel the presence of someone, or something, just beyond the shadows. His body tensed, the fear of being discovered gnawing at him. His hands fumbled in the dark for a weapon, any kind of defense, but there was nothing. He had to think fast. The door behind him was still open, but he had no way of knowing whether it would be safe to run. Whoever was coming was likely part of this covert operation, and he couldn't risk being caught. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps stopped. Nathan held his breath. Was he being watched? The silence was deafening. Then, a low voice broke through the stillness. "I know you're here, Nathan." The voice was cold, methodical, like the whisper of a predator just before the kill. Nathan froze. He had heard that voice before. The mysterious man got a moment of clarity. The man stepped into the faint light coming from the hallway, his figure just a silhouette against the doorframe. Nathan couldn't see his face clearly, but he could make out the sharp outline of his suit and the cold confidence in his posture. "It's over, Nathan. You should have stayed away." Nathan's mind raced. What did the man mean? How had he found him? Why had he waited until now to confront him? "Why are you doing this?" Nathan asked, his voice shaky but determined. "What's the truth behind all of this?" The man stepped closer, and Nathan could see a flicker of something in his eyes, a mix of regret and resolve. "You were never supposed to uncover this. But you did. You've seen too much." The man's tone softened for just a moment. Operation Lazarus wasn't just a project. It was the future, a new kind of life, a new kind of weapon. And we couldn't let anyone destroy that. Nathan swallowed hard. The weight of the man's words hit him like a physical blow. The truth was darker than he could have imagined. It wasn't just about biological experiments or government secrets. It was about something far more terrifying, creating a new kind of human, one built for control. But there was something more. Something the man wasn't telling him. And Thomas? Nathan whispered. Where is Thomas? The man's face faltered for the briefest moment, and in that instant, Nathan knew, Thomas had been part of it all. The man took a deep breath, as though he were preparing to reveal something he knew would change everything. Thomas was the key. He was always the key. But you weren't supposed to find out. We were hoping the project would remain a secret, but your curiosity, forced our hand. Nathan's pulse raced. His mind was spinning, and he had to fight to keep his thoughts from racing ahead of him. Where is he? Nathan asked again, his voice barely above a whisper. What have you done with him? The man remained silent for a moment, before speaking again. Thomas is gone. But what he became, what he was meant to become, is still alive. The ultimate betrayal. Nathan took a step back, his thoughts crashing together in a mess of confusion and disbelief. Gone? What did that even mean? How could Thomas, the one person who had been his anchor through all of this, just disappear? But then it hit him, the man had said what he became. Nathan's eyes widened in realization. No. The man's next words confirmed his worst fear. Thomas didn't just disappear, Nathan. He was transformed. He was the first successful subject in the Lazarus Project. He was turned into something more than human. Nathan's breath caught in his throat. What are you saying? Are you telling me he's... Yes. The man cut him off, his voice now sharp. Thomas is no longer the man you knew. He's part of the project now, part of the future. A future that will change everything. Nathan shook his head in disbelief. He couldn't process it. How could this have happened? How could the person he had been looking for, his best friend, become a weapon? Why are you telling me this? Nathan asked, his voice cracking with emotion. Why come to me now? What do you want? The man stepped closer, and Nathan could feel the weight of his words even before he spoke them. Because, Nathan, you're the only one left who can stop it. The final choice. Nathan's mind reeled. Stop it? How? He was just one person, an ordinary man, caught in the crossfire of something far beyond his control. What could he possibly do? But the man's gaze was unwavering, his expression one of certainty. The project is still ongoing. The Lazarus Initiative isn't over. It's bigger than you realize. It's not just about creating weapons. It's about control over every aspect of human life. And you can stop it. You can end it. Nathan didn't know what to say. His mind flashed back to everything he had uncovered, the keycard, the files, the dark secrets. The truth was staring him in the face, and he had a choice. He could walk away, forget all of this, and live with the consequences. Or he could do something about it. But what was he really up against? Could he take down an operation this powerful? The man's words echoed in his mind. You're the only one left who can stop it. Nathan felt a surge of anger and resolve. He couldn't let it end this way. He couldn't let them win. He had come too far to turn back now. The final decision. Nathan stepped forward, a fire igniting in his chest. He wasn't going to let Thomas's sacrifice be in vain. He wasn't going to let this organization, this twisted project, continue to destroy lives. He looked the man in the eye. Then tell me what I need to do. For the first time, the man's expression softened, a faint trace of something like respect crossing his face. There's a device in the next room, the man said, nodding toward a door behind him. It's connected to the Lazarus network. Destroy it, and the project dies. But know this, there's no going back. You'll never be safe again. Nathan nodded without hesitation. He knew what had to be done. The man stepped aside, allowing him to pass. Nathan walked toward the door, each step heavy with the weight of his decision. The room beyond held the key to everything: Thomas, the Lazarus Project, and the future of humanity. It would be destroyed tonight, or it would destroy him. The final revelation. Nathan opened the door, and there it was, the device. It looked like a machine out of a science fiction movie, a complex tangle of wires and blinking lights. But it was real. And it was powerful. Nathan took a deep breath, steadying his nerves. The decision had been made. He reached forward and slammed his fist down on the device's control panel. The lights flickered and dimmed. The room went silent. And then, the hum of the machine stopped. The epilogue, a new dawn. Nathan stood in the darkness, the silence of the room around him now deafening. He had done it. The Lazarus Project was over. The people behind it, those who had used Thomas and so many others, were no longer a threat, but at what cost? The truth about Thomas haunted him. His friend was gone, changed into something else. He had fought for a future that he would never see.